Welcome back to Digging Deeper Season 2. We're back, and we're better than ever. Today, we're going to talk with McKensie, PhD, and Seth Becker, smartest man I know. We're going to talk about all the places that fleets lose leads and drivers along the entire recruiting process. So it'll be a good one today. You recently presented at R2 and the Solution Summit. Tell us about your presentation a little bit, or the idea of it.
Yep. So I looked at where you losing leads throughout the life of a lead. So I walked us through the very beginning of the life of a lead all the way until that lead gets hired and is hauling freight.
Okay.
And we looked at step by step, where are you losing leads? What are we doing or not doing that's causing drivers to abandon us before they make it to a hire?
What do you mean when you say losing leads? What does that mean to you?
To me, that means a qualified driver could potentially turn into a hire, but until they're hired, they're just a lead. So we've lost them if we can't manage to get them hired.
Okay. Seth, welcome back.
Thank you.
You've worked at a fleet. Why should they care if they're losing leads?
Leads equals money.
Why? Like money is in cost or money is in revenue?
Both. I mean, there's a cost associated with buying those leads, and then there's revenue lost if you're not turning those leads into hires.
Roughly $1,000 a day per driver. So if you were to hire 10 drivers a year and they drove about 260 days each, that's about $2.6 million in revenue for those 10 drivers.
How many leads, I know there's no way to really answer this, but how many leads or fleets do you think actually losing by whatever you're going to tell us? Like, what are we trying to fix here? You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, it's like, are we losing 4 or 5 leads and we're trying to like get every single lead we can? Or it's like we're making big mistakes and we're losing hundreds of leads?
Well, I think there's a known piece
right,
where we know how many we're losing, and then there's probably an unknown piece that we don't know. Sorry to jump in. I was just thinking perfect. Some of it's known, right? Where if it's, the lead to hire ratio, let's say it's 1 in 40, just as a nice even number, that means you've lost 39.
Yeah.
Right. But that's just the ones we know
right.
of. So I don't know, McKensie, if you want to speak to the ones we don't know of.
Yeah. I mean, really, when we say the life of a lead, it begins before a lead ever actually enters our ATS. So there's a whole group of people that we're losing just because we didn't have any marketing, or our marketing wasn't right or didn't look good.
Right.
Because our trucks were dirty and people didn't want to drive for someone that has a dirty truck. So there's a ton of ways we could be losing a lead before it ever is actually a lead.
And I guess what we're saying, if we're going to do a whole presentation about it at R2, we believe that it's a significant enough amount of leads that you should be worried about it. Correct?
Yes, absolutely. I recently worked with a fleet that their hire rate, so the percent of their leads that they converted to a hire was 4%. So they got
It's pretty high, isn't it? I leaned into the mic for that one.
Yeah, I mean, 1 in 40 is what, 2.5%.
Right.
So yeah, 4% isn't bad.
Right.
But that's still a lot of leads that are left on the table, right?
They started with 3,000 leads for the analysis we did. So I'm not going to try to do that math in my head, but 4% of 3,000, that's a lot of leads.
Why don't you give me like the elevator pitch of what your biggest takeaway was from doing this presentation?
My biggest takeaway was we could be losing leads because of our own processes. So our processes aren't smooth. They're not clear. Maybe when someone calls in and tries to connect to a recruiter, maybe they get hung up on, things like that. So the biggest way we can lose less leads is by periodically walking through our own processes. So acting like we're a driver, filling out a lead, looking for an ad, talking to a recruiter, just going through what the process would look like if we're a driver, and just taking a good hard look at what might we be doing that's pushing drivers away.
That's one thing I always say, and I do not get why more people don't do this. Maybe I'm just smarter than everybody. But like if before you launch any campaign, why would you not go through the campaign on every device that you imagine someone would interact with that campaign? Because sometimes you like, oh, this felt great on a desktop, and then you go through it on mobile, it's like, that made no sense. Or vice versa. It's like, I don't understand. Why do people not do that?
Time. They're busy. They have so much going on, and they want their stuff to be live, because as long as your stuff isn't live, you're also losing leads. So you say, let's get it live, and then we'll work out the kinks later.
Would you say that was the biggest takeaway from your presentation, is that the biggest thing is know your process? If you're going to figure out where you're losing leads, you just always need to know what the process feels like and looks like. Did you feel like you always had a good grasp of that when you were doing this?
Not always, no. It takes work, right? And it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
It probably has to be reviewed, I don't know, quarterly, or every time a new campaign goes up, to your point.
Right.
Why not test it? I may be jumping the gun, and we can come back to it later.
Jump away.
I'm going to jump the gun here. So at the Solution Summit, the Alignment Conference,
right,
one of the biggest takeaways that I had, and hopefully the audience had as well, was when live calls were made, right? Where, Scott Maldonado asked.
Yeah, did he actually call people live?
Yeah. He called people live, and he asked for volunteers from the audience of who thinks their recruiters are doing a good job. Let's call them up and find out. Because a lot of the techniques, a lot of the things that we were going over, you would think they're common sense, right? You wouldn't look at them and go, whoa, that's mind-blowing, had no idea. But is it common practice?
Right.
And so what was really funny to me about that is you had a lot of confident people in the audience. The phone calls were made. And after the first one, the recruiter didn't do a good job. And then he asked for another volunteer. And for some reason, somebody raised their hand. And on the second one, the recruiter didn't do a good job. And somebody else raised their hand a third time.
What do you mean by didn't do a good job, Keith?
So he was teaching at that moment an impactful introduction.
Right.
And so once again, asked for volunteers of who thinks their recruiter does a good introduction. And somebody raised their hand, and he called them up on the spot. And it wasn't a good introduction. They didn't even ask the driver's name. They jumped right into qualifying the driver instead of trying to build a little bit of rapport. But yes, after the third time, nobody rose their hand on the fourth time, right? Because nobody...
Did you just say rose their hand?
Did I?
You
did. Nobody raised their hand. Well, that's how it goes. Yeah. Yes. But anyway, it was impactful, I thought.
So how would you go about, so if we take that back to the idea of going through your own process to understand where you might be losing your leads, should that be part of your process? How would you do that? Like, I'm going to call my recruiters. I'm going to blind call them so they don't know would you do that? How would you vet that process out?
I mean, you could, but I think it's even easier than that. Is most people, like if you ask during a conference, which we've done before, who records their phone calls? Yeah. Everybody's hands go up, right? Oh, do you listen to your phone calls? Everybody hands go up, right? They rose them, as it were. So everybody thinks they're doing it, or they say they're doing it.
Right.
But when it comes down to it, if we were being really consistent about it, then we shouldn't be able to call a recruiter on the spot and have them make those same mistakes that we say we're listening for.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get a little more into the nitty gritty. So you don't have to give me, because I know there ended up being 14 steps.
14. And we combined a few.
Okay.
So I think there were like 22 when we started.
And maybe like the download for this thing can be the actual full presentation or something. But why don't you take me through the highlight of kind of the early phase of like, where's the first place we're losing leads?
So you said 14 steps, and we broke it up into 3 phases. So that first phase, we kind of called the PreLead.
Yep.
We got some feedback that sounded inhuman or impersonable, but I'm going to keep going with it.
Okay.
So PreLead was like before something's a lead, before it's ever in an ATS.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is when it's basically all about branding and all about reputation. It's when your trucks and your drivers look a certain way. It's how your ads and landing pages look. It's what your questions are on your short form, the kind of reviews that are online. So the main thing there is we lose leads when we don't manage our reputation. We don't manage what our brand looks like when people just encounter us kind of on their own organically.
One thing I've noticed in my own vast expertise is that when you say manage your brand, I think people tend to think we're just going to put, how to say this, they want to put forth a version of themselves that's unreal. Instead of understanding what their brand is and where they play, like what's their strength, they just say, we're going to say the things that we think drivers want to hear. And it's like, to your point, it's the truck on the road. It's what the reviews say online. It's what truckers say when they actually talk to them. And if all of that is not in sync, or if it's like you say you're one way and every review says that's not true, it's like, then there's where you're losing a lead.
Yeah, we have seen fleets, what they actually are does not align with what their recruiters are saying.
Right.
So like their ads say one thing, their recruiters say something totally different, and then what the drivers experience is something totally different from either of those.
Right.
And drivers lose trust, and then they lose trust just in all fleets in general.
So I guess you could sum that up. If we wanted to sum up that whole part, it'd be like, you lose leads by your overall brand. To stop losing leads there, understand where your brand strengths are, and then make sure those are consistent in every iteration of the brand.
And very clear. Like, people need to be able to associate you and your brand every time they see you. It needs to be in every ad, on every landing page, and all your videos, your testimonials. It just, when people think of Chick-fil-A, they think of customer service. They're synonymous. It needs to be the same way. You need to have your brand, and it needs to be everywhere. So that's all people think of when they think of you. And
like one thing, and interrupt me here, Seth, and add some more meat to this, but one thing I've noticed is like, I'll see ads from fleets advertising home time. Mm-hmm. And then you'll go to the reviews, and every single review's like, well, the pay is pretty good, but the home time sucks. And it'll be like, why are they all advertising home time if every driver says it sucks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one way that a lot of fleets go to market is by looking at what other fleets are doing. Right. So the parody, right, of, hey, it looks like a lot of fleets are talking about this. We should probably talk about this too.
Right.
But to your point, if it's not true, you're doing more harm than good, because maybe you gain that initial interest, but you're just hiring your own turnover at that point.
Ooh, hiring your own turnover. Mm. That should be its own episode. All right. Moving on from kind of the initial, your brand and all the mistakes you make there that make you lose leads. And that's kind of probably more the unknown, like you don't know how many leads you're losing there. What would be the next phase?
Now the leads entered our ATS. So they're officially a lead in what we would traditionally consider them. And this phase ends when that person gets scheduled for orientation. Okay. So orientation is like its own thing in and of itself. So this is basically our processes. Our process of getting a lead from, hey, I'm interested, I'm raising my hand that I want to drive for you, all the way until they're committed and saying, yep, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be at orientation.
Right. All right. What did you find would be the most egregious way people lose leads during this time?
This goes back to not assessing our processes, not going through it ourselves. And a lot of times this has to do with the phone call. The phone call is so important in this phase because it basically is what this phase is. It's the phone call with the recruiter, how you actually get in touch with the recruiter. So how many rings are you having to sit and listen to? Are you getting transferred to a bunch of different people? When someone answers, is it an actual recruiter that says their name, or is it like a recorded list of options you have to listen through? Things like that. So,
Seth, do you remember the listening in where the guy was like, "I'm going to transfer you," and then was like, "Is anybody available?"
Yeah. No use of the mute button there. Yeah. Or no reason to put them on hold. Just scream. It's fine.
What are all transfers bad? Or I mean, should we limit transfers, or what's the deal there?
I mean, I try to put myself in their shoes, and I don't like to be transferred. Now, there's going to be situations where a driver is having issues with their payroll, right? Their pay, and they're just going to call the first number that they Googled.
Right.
So that makes sense that there may be transfers there, but a lot of times it's a driver who maybe we were using, or somebody was using competitive key terms, right? So that driver may be asking for a different fleet. How are we training recruiters to handle that situation? I can't tell you how many hundreds of calls I've listened to where that recruiter turns the driver away because they're like, no, we're not such and such fleet. Good luck. They had a driver on the phone. What are you doing? Why'd you turn them away?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else did you discover kind of during this phase? Maybe a specific example of where people lose leads.
Thinking about, I said it starts when a lead gets into an ATS. So the way we use our ATS can cause us to get more leads or lose more leads. One example I found was a fleet would move their drivers to uninterested or unable to contact if they failed to get in contact with them after one try. So they would send them one phone call, and if that driver didn't answer, they moved them straight to, I think it was unable to contact. And so just the failure of that fleet to have multiple attempting contact statuses meant that driver never got attempted again.
Right. And which I guess in certain markets, one which we may never see again, that might be the way to go, but not in this market, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
And I think right along with that is lead bias, right? So yes, be intentional, have a strategy around which leads convert at a better rate. But yeah, I've also seen recruiters who see a certain source, and then they just, without calling them, put them in, attempted to contact, because they felt like it would waste their time to make that effort.
Yeah, or I heard the example the other day where it was like they tend to, I mean, you may have given this example where it was like, oh, this driver's out of such and such, that's not where we're hiring for. But if you would have talked to the person, they were saying, I'm willing to move,
Right, right. Or just had a different area code or, absolutely. Yep,
Okay.
Happens all the time.
All right, so we've talked about the PreLead. That's more your brand, how it's inconsistent, even down to are your trucks being washed? Because that would, like, dirty trucks. And then the what do we call the next phase?
Just the
lead phase. So that's all the process, and really most of that is essentially the recruiter interacting, how the recruiter interacts with the driver. All right, and then we got the post lead, and where do we lose leads there?
Here is just giving a driver a bad experience. So if there was a survey in Truckers News showed that 83% of drivers have quit a job just because of an orientation process alone. They had a bad orientation experience, so they quit the job right then and there. In fact, I heard about this one driver who went all the way through orientation. He said, an average experience, but then when he was given his truck, it was so dirty that he quit right when he saw the truck. So just in general, if our drivers have a bad experience, we make them feel like they're not cared for, that they're not respected, or we just kind of forget about them, make them go through things we wouldn't want to do ourselves. Scott Maldonado talks about when he was doing orientations, he would make people sleep in bunk beds, like 4 people to a room in bunk beds. So I know I wouldn't want to do that. So we shouldn't make our drivers do it.
And one thing I just thought of, and everyone that's listening is going to be like, duh, we already thought about this. But, when you say, I guess just not having the right connotation, when you say they went to see their truck and it was dirty, I'm thinking about my truck being dirty, and it's like, oh, the outside is dirty, but I don't care. But you're inheriting somebody's home. Mm-hmm. And so when you think of a dirty home, that's a lot different than a dirty truck. And then they probably think of it more as, I'm inheriting somebody else's dirty apartment. So I've heard a lot in all my interactions with our clients and different fleets, the term ghosting is talked a lot about, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's I talked to someone, they were really interested, and then I never heard from them again.
Right.
How much is that just drivers finding better offers, and how much of that could we mitigate through a change in process? Roundabout.
I don't think that has to be an either or. So a lot of times drivers have found a better offer, but because our processes are so bad, we allowed them to keep looking or get swept up by another company.
what could we do to help make that?
Stay in contact with them, text messages all the time, get them connected to more people at the company.
Yeah.
So if they've only talked to one recruiter one time, it's pretty easy to just kind of say, peace, like, I'm not going to see you again.
Yeah.
But if they've talked to 3 different people, they know their names, they've had full-on text conversations at least once a day, it's really hard to ghost someone when you have that kind of connection.
One thing, and I do watch your show religiously, Seth.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that you talked about is when you're getting off the phone with a driver, instead of saying like, hey, we'll look to hear from you, or, you know, that sort of thing, you setting the expectation of, I'm going to reach out to you, or something of that nature. Can you go into a little more depth there?
Yeah, I mean, it ties in with what McKensie was saying, which is keep that conversation going. And so the driver's going to feel more of a sense of commitment when they spend time with you, right?
Right.
And so by setting that expectation of, here's when I'm going to follow up, here's what we're going to talk about, here are next steps, it removes some of that unknown, right? And naturally, we tend to gravitate towards what we know. And so the more of that we can do on the front end, the more comfortable the driver is going to already feel coming into it. And it all goes back to experience, right? What is it like for the driver? Because if they've got a few fleets they've been talking to and they're already having a bad experience at one, super easy to shift gears and go somewhere else.
Right.
So that contributes to the ghosting as well.
Okay. Well, why don't you do a sum up of like, this is the big takeaway from this presentation I did, because I know you worked a long time on it.
Yep. Big takeaway is we lose leads when we fail to think about things from the driver's perspective. When we fail to put ourselves in the driver's shoes and see, what do they think of when they see our brand? What do they have to go through when they go through our processes? What sort of experience do they have when they do our orientation? If we're not thinking about it from the driver's perspective, we're thinking about what's easy and best for us, we're inevitably going to lose some drivers.
What would you add to that?
So McKensie is brilliant. And so I'm not minimizing what she said at all. But I think anybody would listen to what you just said and shake their head and be like, we're doing that. Like, yes, okay, yeah, I know, we already know that. But going back to what I referred to earlier about the phone calls, common knowledge does not equal common practice. So while they may say, yes, we know that, are they doing it?
Those guys.
Are we doing it? Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it goes right along with what she's saying. It's the right answer, but then turn it into action and do it. Don't just say, yeah, we know that.
Well, I think that's where we'll end it for now. We're back in black for Digging Deeper Season 2. Yeah. That's it.